Deep in the Montana wilderness, Abby stood frozen as three drifters cornered her near the old barn. They thought she was a helpless girl on a lonely ranch, but they didn't see the golden eyes watching from the shadows. The lead man took a step forward, a cruel smile on his face. He reached out to grab Abby's arm, thinking the silence of the woods was his best friend. But that silence was about to be broken by a sound that didn't belong to a human. A low, vibrating growl started near the haystacks. It wasn't a dog. It was deeper, heavier. Suddenly, a blur of fur and muscle launched from the darkness. It was Duke. But to these men, Duke didn't look like the Maine Coon cat Abby's grandmother thought she bought. He looked like a nightmare with four paws. Duke landed between Abby and the drifters, his tufted ears pinned back and his 4-inch claws digging into the dirt. The men tumbled backward, tripping over their own feet in pure terror. One of them screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed off the mountains. They didn't wait for a second look. They scrambled into their beat-up truck and tore down the gravel road, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust. Abby's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at Duke. The wild animal turned, his fierce eyes softening instantly, and he let out a tiny, soft chirp. He was her protector. He was her family. But as the dust settled, Abby realized this was only the first warning. The real shadows were still moving in the trees. Life at the ranch wasn't always this heart-pounding. Just a few weeks ago, the only thing Abby had to worry about was helping her grandmother, Eleanor, with the morning chores. Montana is a place of big skies and even bigger hearts, but it can be lonely. Eleanor had lived on this land for 50 years. After her husband Bill passed away, the silence in the house grew heavy. Eleanor's eyes weren't what they used to be, but her spirit was as tough as old leather. She wanted a companion, a little something to keep her company while she knit by the fire. That's when she met a man named Old Joe at the county fair. He sold her what he called an extra-large Maine Coon kitten. Eleanor fell in love instantly. She brought him home, named him Duke, and tied a little red bandana around his neck. When Abby arrived from the city to visit, she expected to see a fluffy house cat. Instead, she found a 25-pound bobcat sitting on the kitchen table, calmly eating a piece of premium steak. Abby's breath caught in her throat when she first saw him. She knew her grandmother's eyesight was failing, but how could she not see this was a predator? "Gran," Abby whispered, "that's not a cat. That's a wild animal." Eleanor just laughed, her voice like wind chimes. "Oh, Abby, he's just a big bone boy. Look at how he purrs." And he did purr, but he also watched the woods with an intensity no house cat ever possessed. One evening, while Eleanor was napping, Abby noticed Duke standing perfectly still by the screen door. His tail, short and bobbed, was twitching. Abby looked out into the yard and saw it, a mountain lion. It was stalking toward the porch, its lean body hugging the ground. It was twice the size of Duke. Abby went to scream, but no sound came out. She was sure they were done for. Duke didn't wait. He didn't hiss like a cat. He let out a roar that sounded like a saw cutting through hardwood. He slammed his body against the screen door, showing a set of teeth that made the mountain lion freeze. The two predators stared at each other for what felt like an hour. Finally, the mountain lion blinked. It realized this ranch was guarded. It turned and vanished back into the pines. Duke sat back down and started licking his paws if nothing had happened. Abby realized then that Duke wasn't just a pet. He was a sentinel. But she couldn't help but wonder, if a mountain lion was coming this close to the house, what were they running from? Stay with me, because what Duke does next will prove that some bonds are written in the stars, not just in nature. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of peace. Abby watched as Duke became more than just a guard. He became Eleanor's shadow. When Eleanor would walk to the mailbox, Duke would walk exactly 3 inches behind her, his eyes scanning the brush for snakes or coyotes. When she sat in her rocking chair to listen to her old Johnny Cash records, Duke would lie across her feet like a warm, living rug. It was a beautiful, lonesome sight. Abby started to see the world through her grandmother's eyes. Maybe it didn't matter that Duke was a bobcat. Maybe what mattered was that he chose to stay. But the peace of Montana is often a mask. One afternoon, Abby found something in the high grass near the creek that broke her heart. It was a tiny fawn, only a few days old, shivering and alone. Its mother was nowhere to be seen. Abby knew the rules of the wild. Don't touch, don't interfere. But the little thing was so weak. She looked up and saw Duke watching from a distance. He didn't look hungry. He looked concerned. Abby decided to bring the fawn closer to the barn, just to give it a chance to hide from the coyotes. She named her Little Willow. For 3 days, Abby and Eleanor bottle-fed the fawn with goat's milk. Duke was fascinated. He would sit by the pen, resting his head on the wooden slats. He didn't see a meal, he saw a guest. But then the mountain lion returned. This time, it wasn't alone. It was hungry, and it had tracked the scent of the fawn right to the barn door. It was a moonless night, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Abby heard the wood splinter. She grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the barn, her heart thumping in her ears. She saw the mountain lion's yellow eyes reflected in the beam of light. It was crouched, ready to spring over the gate at Little Willow. Abby stepped forward, waving her arms, but the cougar just hissed, its ears flat against its skull. It wasn't afraid of her. Just as the cougar leaped, a streak of gray and tan fur intercepted it in midair. It was Duke. The two cats tumbled into the hay, a whirlwind of fur and growls. Duke was smaller, but he was fighting for his home. He landed a sharp blow to the cougar's nose, and the larger cat recoiled. In that moment of chaos, Abby saw something else in the trees. Another deer. It wasn't just any deer. It was a large doe, watching the barn with desperate eyes. The doe didn't run. She stood her ground as if she was waiting for her baby. The cougar, realizing it was outnumbered by a girl, a bobcat, and a mother spirit, retreated into the darkness. Duke stood over the fawn, his chest heaving. He looked at the doe in the woods, and for a second, it was as if they shared a silent understanding. But the danger wasn't over. The mountain lion was still out there, and now the drifters from town had heard rumors about a monster cat at the old lady's ranch. They were coming back, and this time, they were bringing rifles. You won't believe how Duke handles a threat that doesn't have fur, but has a heart of stone. The next morning, the ranch felt different. The air was thick and heavy, like the sky was holding its breath before a storm. Eleanor was worried. She had heard the ruckus in the barn, and though she couldn't see the scratches on the door, she could feel the tension in Duke's fur. "Something is coming, Abby," she whispered over her coffee. "The woods are talking, and they aren't happy." Abby tried to stay positive, but she spent the day boarding up the barn and keeping Little Willow close. She noticed Duke wasn't napping anymore. He was patrolling the perimeter of the fence, his head low, his eyes fixed on the road. Late that afternoon, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled into the driveway. Abby's heart sank. It was the Fish and Wildlife Department. 2 officers stepped out. They had received a tip that a dangerous exotic animal was being kept illegally on the property. "We're here for the bobcat, miss," the taller officer said, his voice cold and professional. "He's a public safety risk." Eleanor came out onto the porch, her hand trembling as she reached for the railing. "He's my cat," she cried. "He hasn't hurt a soul." The officers didn't care. They pulled out a tranquilizer gun. Duke was sitting under the porch watching them. He knew. He could sense the metal, the intent. Abby felt a surge of anger. Someone had told them. Someone wanted Duke gone so they could get to the ranch. This was a different kind of fight. You can't claw your way out of a legal order. The officers began to circle the house. "If you don't hand him over, we'll have to use force," they warned. Abby stood in front of the porch, her arms crossed. "He's a rescue. He saved us from a mountain lion." But to them, he was just a liability. Just as the officer raised the dart gun, a loud bang echoed from the driveway. It wasn't a gunshot, it was a tire blowing out. A rusty, battered truck swerved into the yard, narrowly missing the government SUV. It was the drifters from before. They were drunk, angry, and they were holding hunting rifles. "We heard there's a bounty on a lynx," the leader shouted, staggering out of the truck. "Move aside, feds. We'll take care of this pest for free." The situation turned into a powder keg. The wildlife officers turned their attention to the armed men, shouting for them to drop their weapons. The drifters didn't listen. They thought they were the kings of the mountain. In the confusion, Duke vanished. He slipped through the shadows like smoke. Abby felt a cold shiver. She knew Duke wasn't running away. He was hunting. The lead drifter raised his rifle toward the porch, aiming at Eleanor. "Move, old woman!" he yelled. The wildlife officers reached for their sidearms. It was seconds away from a tragedy. But then, a terrifying sound came from the roof of the house. Duke had climbed the trellis and was perched on the shingles directly above the drifters. He didn't growl this time. He let out a scream that sounded like a woman in distress, a classic bobcat trick that freezes the blood of any man. The drifter jumped, his rifle firing harmlessly into the air. Before he could reload, Duke landed on the hood of the drifter's truck with the force of a falling boulder. The windshield shattered. The men panicked, dropping their guns and diving back into their cab. The wildlife officers, seeing the true nature of the drifters, tackled the men and began cuffing them. In the middle of the yard, Duke stood on top of the truck, the little red bandana still around his neck, looking down at everyone like a king. The officers looked at Duke, then at the cuffed criminals, and then at the sobbing Eleanor. The tall officer slowly put his dart gun away. He looked at Abby and whispered, "I didn't see a bobcat here today. I only saw a very large, very brave house cat. But the most emotional moment is yet to come, as the secret of the mother deer finally reveals itself." The drifters were hauled away in the back of the police cruiser, and the wildlife officers left with a wink and a warning to keep that cat inside. The ranch fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a battle won. Eleanor sat on the porch, her hand finally resting on Duke's head. "I told you he was a good boy," she whispered, her eyes wet with tears. Abby sat beside them, watching the sun begin to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. But then, Abby remembered Little Willow. She walked over to the barn to check on the fawn. As she approached, she saw Duke already there. He was sitting by the gate, but he wasn't looking at the fawn. He was looking past the fence toward the edge of the woods. Abby followed his gaze. There, standing in the twilight, was the doe. She was closer than she had ever been. She didn't look scared. She looked expectant. Abby looked at the fawn, then at the mother. She knew what she had to do. She opened the gate. Little Willow shivered, her tiny legs wobbling as she stepped out onto the grass. Duke stood up and walked beside the fawn, nudging her gently with his nose toward the woods. Abby held her breath. Would the mother accept her back after being handled by humans? The fawn let out a soft bleat. The doe stepped forward, her ears forward, sniffing the air. She walked right up to the edge of the clearing. Little Willow took a shaky step, then another, then a little trot. When they reached each other, the doe began to lick the fawn's head with a ferocity of love that made Abby's throat tighten. The reunion was beautiful, but it was interrupted by a snap of a twig. The mountain lion hadn't left. It had been waiting for the fawn to be vulnerable again. It lunged from the brush, a golden streak of death aimed right at the mother and child. Abby screamed, but she was too far away. The doe tried to shield her baby, but she was no match for a cougar. But Duke... Duke was already moving. He didn't just attack. He threw himself into the path of the lion. This wasn't about territory anymore. This was about life. The two cats clashed in a brutal struggle of claws and teeth. Duke was half the size, but he had the heart of a lion. He clung to the cougar's neck, refusing to let go. They tumbled down a small embankment, a chaotic mess of fur. The doe took the chance and vanished into the deep forest with Little Willow, safe at last. Abby ran to the edge of the hill. Her heart stopped. "Duke!" she shrieked. Below, the mountain lion pulled itself out of the brush. It was limping, bleeding, and finally, it had had enough. It turned and fled into the high timber, defeated for good. Abby scrambled down the hill. Duke was lying in the dirt. He wasn't moving. His little red bandana was torn and covered in dust. Abby scooped him up, her tears falling onto his fur. "Please, Duke, please don't leave us," she sobbed. She felt his body, so small compared to the threats he had faced. She carried him back to the house, her legs shaking. Eleanor was standing on the porch, her face white. "Is he?" Abby laid him on the kitchen table, the very place he used to sit and eat steak. She cleaned his wounds, her hands trembling. For an hour there was no sound but the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then a small, ragged breath. Then a twitch of a tufted ear. Duke opened one golden eye. He looked at Abby, then at Eleanor, and let out a soft, tired purr. He had survived. He had saved the fawn, he had saved the ranch, and he had saved their hearts. The weeks turned into months. Winter arrived in Montana, draping the ranch in a thick white blanket of snow. The mountains looked like sleeping giants. Inside the cabin, the fire was roaring. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, a new quilt over her lap. Duke was curled up in his favorite spot, right on her feet. He had a few more scars on his ears and he moved a little slower, but he was still the king of the house. Abby stood by the window, looking out at the snow. She saw two sets of tracks leading out of the woods toward the barn, a large set and a small set. The doe and Little Willow, now a strong yearling, still visited every now and then. They would stand by the fence and Duke would watch them from the window, his tail giving a single, happy flick. They were never truly alone, not as long as they had each other, not as long as the wild stayed just a little bit tamed by love. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a sanctuary. Eleanor looked up from her knitting, her eyes finding Abby's silhouette. "You know, Abby," she said softly, "Bill always said that Montana gives you exactly what you need, right when you need it. I guess I just needed a cat with a little bit of mountain in him." Abby smiled and walked over to pet Duke's thick, soft fur. He leaned into her hand, a wild predator turned into a guardian angel. The silence of the ranch was no longer heavy. It was full, it was warm, and it was safe. If this story of Duke's bravery touched your heart, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear about the special animals in your life who have protected you. And don't forget to click on the next video to see more incredible rescues that prove animals are the true heroes of our world. Thank you for watching, and God bless.